Kia ora koutou katoa, it's Mrs. Goodson here. This is lesson 13 for level 1 science about genetic variation. And this video really is about adaptive features and survival. And it brings together the things about genetic variation, why it's important. Why have we been studying about genetic variation? We've been learning all about DNA and alleles and patterns of inheritance, Punnett squares and pedigree charts, and how sexual reproduction and meiosis lead to genetic variation. And this really explains why variation is important. So we're going to talk about the definition and understanding of adaptation of a species to its environment and explain how survival rates may depend on the phenotype or the observable trait. So adaptation, or also known as evolutionary adaptation, is the adjustment of organisms or living things to their environment in order to improve their chances of survival in that environment. And this is a little example. This amazing leafy sea dragon here blends in with its environment so that it avoids its predators. So it is quite an elaborate, amazing creature that has allowed it to blend in with the environment and camouflage. And you can imagine that the animals that can camouflage better and hide from their predators are more likely to survive and pass on their successful gene. Okay, so any number of characteristics can vary among individuals of a given species. So that's genetic variation. So some may be larger, hairier, fight off infections better, or have smaller ears. These characteristics are largely determined by their genes, which are passed down from their parents and subsequently passed down to their own offspring. Some of these characteristics or traits provide competitive advantages like speed, strength, or attractiveness. If these traits are particularly helpful, individuals with those traits will produce more offspring. Okay, so the ones that have the advantage will survive better, they will reproduce better, and they will have more offspring than those without these traits. And so over generation, the number of individuals that have advantageous traits or adaptations will increase until it becomes a general attribute of the species. So this leads to natural selection. Natural selection is the process through which populations of living organisms adapt and change. Individuals in a population are naturally variable, meaning they all are different in some ways. This variation means that some individuals have traits better suited to the environment than others. Individuals with adaptive traits that give them an advantage are more likely to survive and reproduce. These individuals then pass the adaptive traits onto their offspring. Over time, these advantageous traits become more common in the population. Through this process of natural selection, favorable traits are transmitted through the generation. So natural selection is something that happens over time and as the species adapts to the environment. So genetic variation enables natural selection. A genetically healthy population is defined as having a large amount of genetic variability, lots of differences. The information for each of a living thing's characteristics is carried on a gene, but a gene can have different forms, and we know that these are called alleles. And a large range of alleles leads to a wide variety of genetic options or genetic possibilities. So we get lots of variation. With a large amount of genetic variation, natural selection is able to operate by changing the frequency of particular alleles in response to environmental conditions. Alleles providing a survival benefit to a population increase in frequency, while those producing a selective disadvantage decrease or are lost altogether from the population. The impact of natural selection acting on population can be observed through phenotypic or physical traits. Okay, so go back to my pen, not the highlighter, not the plus or minus. Okay, so genetic variation enables natural selection. So why does this matter? No two members of the same species are identical. These differences between individuals is the variation in the population. having variation leads to greater survivability of the population or the species as a whole. Variation is numerous and wide-ranging. This could include skin, hair color, resistance to disease, height, flower color. These inherited characteristics are called traits and carried as genes in that organism's genetic code, so it's carried by the DNA. Other traits lead to less survivability, so the opposite is also true. The organism may not live to adulthood and not produce offspring. These traits die out or become extinct. Over a long period of time, many generations, the traits of these population changes and the population evolves. And evolves just means it changes over time. So let's think about giraffes. We often use giraffes as an example of evolution. So giraffes are animals that feed on the leaves of tall trees. Other species of animals enter the ecosystem that eats the lower leaves of these plants. So giraffes with long necks have better access to food and become healthier. The shorter necked giraffes are more likely to die out before reproducing. The giraffes with longer necks have better survivability. Over time, the average length of a giraffe's neck increases. Not all variation is genetic. The environment has an effect on how an organism's traits are actually observed. A tomato plant may have a gene for being tall, but with reduced light or water access, its actual height could be short. It will still pass on genes for tallness onto the next generation, though, as it carries the genes for tallness. It is important to see that genes can only be passed on if that organism reproduces. If changes occur to the organism's genetic code, i.e. mutations, then they will only be passed on if these occur in the sex organs. Okay, so if you get mutations during meiosis and it affects the gametes, then you get the DNA to pass on. Changes to your skin's DNA will not be inherited. Only changes that occur to the cells in the ovaries or testes, which produce sperm and ova for reproduction. So why is life on Earth so diverse? Natural selection can lead to speciation, where one species gives rise to a new and distinctly different species. It is one of the processes that drives evolution and helps to explain the diversity of life on Earth. So this video has been about adaptive features and survival, and we've defined and understanding adaptation of a species to its environment and natural selection. And we've used it to explain how survival rates may depend on phenotype or observable traits. And we've also talked about how genetic variation leads to natural selection.